Ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, in 2022, America approaches its semi-quincentennial of the independence of our nation. The United States of America stands at crossroads. Disturbingly, after the January 6th insurrection of our capital, which sought to block the peaceful transfer of power after a free and fair election, a growing number of Americans believe that violence against government can be justified, according to recent polling. We have witnessed a disturbing rise of threats against law enforcement officials from various domestic violent extremist groups, as well as threats and intimidations against public officials such as school board officials and election workers that are simply doing their job. We must condemn acts of violence from all corners and prosecute those who seek to harm public officials to the fullest extent of the law. We've also witnessed the rise of election deniers in the 2022 midterm elections, which repeat the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen and pledge their loyalty to a particular candidate or ideology instead of the rule of law. Mr. President, we've seen a rise of violent actions, rise of anti-Semitism, a rise of hate crimes, and it is very much connected to the assault on our democratic institutions. All of us must be defenders of the democratic institutions that are the bedrock of America. As we saw in the 22 elections, different interpretations of the Electoral Count Act of 1887 can lead down a dangerous path, such as when former President Donald Trump and his enablers attempted to overthrow a free and fair election won by President Joe Biden, leading to the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. We were there. We were in harm's way. We know exactly how violent that group of insurrectionists were. President Trump's latest outrage is to talk about suspending the Constitution because he lost the election. Free and fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power are fundamental to who we are as a nation. For this reason, several months ago, I joined a bipartisan working group of roughly 20 senators to make urgent changes to our presidential election processes. I am pleased that in July of 2022, our group reached a bipartisan agreement to modernize the Electoral Count Act, ECA, of 1887, and make other needed changes to improve the presidential transition process. Our bipartisan working group legislative proposal, the Electoral Count Reform Act, clarifies the appropriate state and federal roles in selecting the president and vice president of the United States. It makes it easier for Congress to identify a single conclusive slate of electors from each state, in part by requiring states to follow the rules they set before the election when designating their electors. We reiterate that the Vice President has a purely ceremonial function in the mandatory joint session of Congress to count the electoral votes. This was in direct response to President Trump's pressure campaign against Vice President Mike Pence to throw out the electoral votes from certain states, which enabled and led to the January 6th insurrection and attack on the Capitol. We also increased the threshold needed to lodge objections against electoral votes to lessen the chance of frivolous objections in the future. And our legislation has a strong provision for expedited federal judicial review to resolve legal challenges more efficiently before the Electoral College meets to cast their votes. I particularly want to thank Senator Susan Collins and Joe Manchin for leading this effort, as well as the other working group members, Senator Portman, Sinema, Romney, Shaheen, Murkowski, Warner, Tillis, Murphy, Capito, Young, Coons, and Sass. This is how the Senate should operate. Our working group made several additional useful recommendations as part of the Presidential Transition Improvement Act and Enhanced Election Security and Protection Act. This legislation would strengthen presidential transition, improve the U.S. Postal Service's handling of election mail, stiffen criminal penalties for those who threaten or intimidate election officials, and reauthorize the Election Assistance Commission. The Election Assistance Commission helps administer grants to states and provides the best practices for election officials in various areas, including cybersecurity, election audits, and voting accessibility. I am pleased that the Senate Rules Committee promptly held a hearing on our legislative proposal and that our legislation has been endorsed by a broad and diverse coalition of public interest groups. In particular, I want to thank Chair Klobuchar and Ranking Member Blunt for making this proposal earlier this year and marking it up in their committee. I am pleased that the Senate Rules and Administration Committee reported out the legislation by an overwhelming bipartisan vote of 14-1 in September of 2022. The committee made improvements in the legislation. Again, that's how the process should work under the leadership of Senator Klobuchar and Blunt. I'm also pleased that the legislation has been co-sponsored by our leaders, Leader Schumer and Leader McConnell. It's now time for the Senate to act. Our legislation, S 4573, now has a strong bipartisan mix of 37 co-sponsors. We must enact these reforms this month before the 118th Congress convenes in 2023. We all know that the presidential election cycle starts early, and we must make sure that this law is enacted before we start in 2023. As my dear friend, the late Congressman John Lewis said, democracy is not a state. It is an act, and each generation must do its part. I urge every Marylander and American to get involved. Stand up for our democratic system of government and the rule of law. Congress should act now to make sure that the lawful and rightful winner of the 2024 presidential election is ultimately certified as the winner by the states and Congress. We cannot fail in this solemn duty to do everything we can to prevent another insurrection like we saw on January 6th, which showed how fragile our democracy really is. We have an obligation to defend it together as we continue our great American experiment with a democratic republic that serves as a beacon of freedom and human rights throughout the world. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.